I'm Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, and this is the Autoimmune Protocol Lecture Series, Week 3, Lecture 1, Introduction to AIP Eliminations. We've talked a lot about what to eat, and the reason why I wanted to start there in this lecture series is because I think it's very, very important to emphasize not just the role that nutrient density has in a well-functioning immune system and recovering from chronic disease, but also emphasize that there's a tremendous variety of foods that we get to eat on the autoimmune protocol. We get to eat all different kinds of meat and seafood and vegetables of all kinds, fruit. We get to cook those things in delicious fats with fresh herbs and really make really delicious meals out of AIP ingredients. But there's this other whole side to the coin. Healing from autoimmune disease is not just about providing the immune system with the nutritional resources that it needs to function. It's about removing stimulators and triggers for inflammation, and that's where the eliminations come into play. The list of autoimmune protocol eliminations can seem very intimidating. One of the reasons why I started with what we do eat is to kind of kick the can on this part a little bit. As you look at this list of foods that we're not going to eat, grains, legumes, dairy products, processed and refined foods, vegetables of the nightshade family, coffee and chocolate and eggs and alcohol, some of these may be your staple foods, and living without them might seem intimidating, might seem like a really big ask. So we're going to take the next 2 weeks to go through the compounds that are in these foods and what problematic effects they have on our bodies that are the reason why these foods are eliminated. Now, I want to emphasize once again from the get-go that the autoimmune protocol at its core is an elimination diet, which means we're cutting out those foods that are the most likely to be culprits in driving your autoimmune condition. That doesn't mean that all of these foods are culprits for you. There's a tremendous amount of bio-individuality here. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to talk about what compounds are in these foods that are a problem, but I do want you to keep in mind that at the end of an elimination phase of the autoimmune protocol, when you've flooded the body with nutrients, with your nutrient density focus, you've given it the opportunity to heal through the lifestyle focus, you've removed immune stimulators and problematic compounds from a gut health perspective and a hormone regulation perspective, and you're starting to feel better. One key part to the autoimmune protocol is reintroductions, and we're going to talk about that a lot more in week 6 and a little bit more next week. But I want you to, as we start to dive into eliminations, remember that this is not a life sentence. There's certainly some foods in here that you may never add back into your life, and that's okay. This is knowledge is really supposed to be empowering. You're supposed to be able to understand how these foods are interacting with your body in such a way that you know whether or not those foods are good foods for you and that you can make very smart and informed choices moving forward. And once you start to be able to modify diet and lifestyle to really affect your health and to really regain your health and feel energetic and happy and pain-free again, suddenly missing out on some of these foods that might be your staples now, it doesn't seem like deprivation. It seems like a really powerful tool for health. So keep all of those big concepts in mind as we start to dive into the details. Now remember that autoimmune disease is caused by this confluence of events. About 1/3 of your risk factor for autoimmune disease comes from genetic predisposition. There's another amount of factors that is history of infection, environmental triggers, potentially bad luck, and then this modifiable component, which is diet and lifestyle. We've talked a lot about nutrient deficiencies and how they can contribute to immune dysfunction. This is our chance to talk about compounds in foods that potentially undermine health. We're talking about how food, even some foods that we have historically viewed as being very healthy options, may not actually support human health to the level that is necessary with autoimmune disease. And really, at the end of the day, this boils down to looking at foods by a metric where we are considering what compounds that are in that food that are going to support health, what nutrients it has. We could very simplistically call this good stuff in food, right? It's the things in food like vitamins and minerals and phytochemicals and fiber, complete protein, healthy fats, the things that our bodies need as raw materials, as the elements of chemical reactions, right? It's what our bodies need to be able to function. And what might be in that food that might undermine our health in any particular way. A compound that might be inflammatory, might feed the wrong kind of bacteria in our gut. We're going to go through that collection of problematic compounds in a lot of detail. Really, when we're looking at those compounds, we're looking at them by a few different metrics. So some of them are directly inflammatory, they directly stimulate the immune system. But a lot of them can disrupt immune health via a couple of really important concepts. So one is gut health, which we've already talked about a fair bit. So there are compounds in foods that are problematic from a gut health perspective, and that feeds into the immune system. Some can be problematic from a hormone regulation standpoint. We're going to talk about that in a lot more detail. So they can negatively impact the regulation or sensitivity of some hormones, and that can feed in to immune health. And then there's some foods where it's not so much the problematic compounds in the foods so much as their complete lack of nutrition. So when we're consuming those foods, they are displacing more nutrient-dense options from our diet. And some compounds in foods hit all of those buttons at the same time. And those are, of course, the worst offenders. And we're going to start with those ones. So really, we're looking at, from a gut health perspective, compounds in foods that may negatively impact gut barrier health or negatively impact the gut microbial community. From a hormone perspective, we're looking at hormones that feed into the immune system. So there's a tremendous amount of hormones in the body. These are like long-distance communication molecules. So they're produced by endocrine glands like the pituitary gland, like the adrenal glands, like the thyroid gland, like the pancreas. They're generally released into the circulation, which means they're released into the blood to flow throughout the body. And they are then bind to receptors in other cells in the body to communicate something. So for example, thyroid hormones control cellular metabolism throughout the body. So your thyroid gland is releasing these thyroid hormones. They're then interacting with every cell in the body to drive metabolism, right? So that's really driving, in a real life sense, how energetic you feel. So there are certain hormones that are impacted by compounds in foods that also feed into the immune system. So those are the ones we're going to focus on. We're going to talk about cortisol and insulin and leptin and ghrelin chiefly, although we're also going to talk a little bit about melatonin and also estrogen mimicking compounds or sex hormones. So we're going to hit all of those at some point over the next 2 weeks. So I want to give you a little bit of a preview of the compounds that we're going to be going into. And it's okay if right now these just sound like a lot of complicated names for things. As we go through the next 2 weeks, you're going to become more and more familiar with each of these classes of compounds. So in terms of gut health, we're looking at 3 different criteria. So compounds in foods that open up tight junctions, that causes increased intestinal permeability because the gut epithelial cells are no longer able to regulate how substances are passing between them into the body. And the substances that we're going to be looking at that affect tight junction formation are agglutinins and prolamins. These are proteins in grains and legumes, and also nightshades, vegetables of the nightshade family, and alcohol. We're also going to be talking about compounds in foods that damage epithelial cells in the gut. So if you damage a cell, that's creating a much larger hole for substances to leak into the body than just impacting the junctions between those cells. So that's an actually even bigger stimulus for inflammation and a bigger challenge to gut health. So again, we're going to talk about how agglutinins and prolamins can damage epithelial cells as well as saponins, including glycoalkaloids. Again, these are substances found in grains and legumes and vegetables of the nightshade family, as well as pseudograins. So we're going to be covering why each of these foods can be really problematic from an immune health standpoint by really breaking down the problematic compounds that are available in each of these different classes of foods. We're also going to talk about foods that can feed the wrong type of bacteria in the gut or suppress the growth of probiotic bacteria in the gut. Prolamins and agglutinins are still on this list, as are alcohols, excess sugar and starch, high omega-6 fatty acid intake, digestive enzyme inhibitors, and emulsifiers, which we're going to be talking about in the broader perspective of processed and refined foods in general. We're also going to be talking about foods that impact hormones, specifically cortisol, insulin, melatonin a little bit, leptin and ghrelin. We're going to talk about how those can influence immune function. So when it comes to problematic compounds in foods that are affecting those hormones that then feed into the immune system, we're going to be looking at excess sugars and starch, sweeteners, sugar substitutes, the role of inadequate fiber. That's a little bit touching on nutrient density, but it's really, really important. So we're going to come back to it. We're going to talk about meal composition in general. That can actually have a pretty big effect on the regulation of some of these hormones. Large caloric excess or deficits. And here's where we're going to talk about pesticides and phytoestrogens, because those are directly impacting hormone systems. And of course, I mentioned that some compounds in foods are directly inflammatory. So it's not a multi-step process to immune dysfunction, it is direct to immune dysfunction. So we're going to be talking about these various compounds that are directly inflammatory, including agglutinins and saponins, excess sugars and starch, high omega-6 fatty acid intake, trans and oxidized fats, digestive enzymes inhibitors, emulsifiers, pesticides, and high salt intake, and how those can directly influence how the immune system is functioning, and how, more specifically, they can directly support immune dysfunction in a way that is permissive for autoimmune disease. So we're going to cover all of these things in detail. So what I want you to think about right now is not that there's an overwhelming number of different compounds to go through, but that the foods these compounds in are very thematic. We see them in grains, we see them in legumes, we see them in nightshades, we see them in dairy products and nuts and seeds, and we're going to go through each of these compounds and how they can negatively impact health by way of really understanding the importance of each AIP elimination to empower you to be able to make the best choices for your particular health situation.